Okay, AP World History students. So I'm going to do a quick little lecture here for you guys on the process of globalization. It's going to be very important overall for the project that you have coming up and just for your general knowledge about where we are now in the 20th century and 21st century after World War II. So what is the deal with globalization? Okay, closer here so you guys can see this. So globalization really gets started off because of these treaties right here that get signed. Okay, so the first three, the IMF, the World Bank, and GATT, were all signed back in around 1944 to 1947, right after we have World War II. Their primary purpose was to start developing the entire world and getting the entire world involved within international trade. So the IMF is known as the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund sets rules for how trade ought to take place. So what are these rules? Well, let's go over them really quick because they're actually pretty important. One, according to the IMF, countries must industrialize. Two, countries must fight inflation. And three, countries must open up to trade. And that means international trade. So those are our three big rules that you have to do according to the IMF. If you do those rules, then you can get loans from the World Bank in order to industrialize. Now, along with that, to open up to trade, the countries agreed to lower their tariffs. And that's what this agreement was here, called the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Now, in the 1990s, there were some treaties done to kind of like back those up. And the big treaties that were done during the 1990s were the WTO and NAFTA. And what WTO did, it's known as the World Trade Organization, it was an international court where countries can actually sue each other if they don't lower their tariffs. NAFTA was an agreement here between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And the purpose behind NAFTA was to create a regional trade zone where countries would lower their tariffs in order to trade back and forth. And in Europe, back actually in the 1970s and 1980s, there was an agreement known as the European Union, which did the same thing. European countries decided they were going to lower their tariffs in order to create trade back and forth between European countries. So what is the whole idea behind this? Why are they doing this? Well, the reason why they're doing this gets to this issue right here, and I'll get you guys a little bit closer so you guys can see this. The reason why they're doing this has to do with the relationship between what's called the developed world and the developing world. So the developed world tends to be in the northern hemisphere, not always, but tends to be within places like Europe and the United States. They provide consumers that will buy goods that were made in developing countries in the southern hemisphere, and they were made because of cheap labor. So the idea behind this is known as comparative advantage. And comparative advantage basically argues that countries should focus in on what they're good at. So countries in the developing world that are good at providing cheap labor at this point can provide that cheap labor, attract companies to come in and invest, and over time they're going to get better and better. The developed world, which tends to be a little more technologically sophisticated right now in software, also provides consumers with a lot more money. They can buy goods from the developing world, and by doing that, that allows the developed world to continue developing their technology. Now, the idea is both countries should really benefit out of this. So, in the end, does this really work? Well, there are some challenges to consider that come out of this column, so you guys can see this. So the challenges that are coming out of this are the following. First of all, there's been a culture clash that takes place. In a lot of parts of the world, especially developing parts of the world, there's a more traditional type of culture. And what globalization does inherently is it starts to break that down. Globalization and international competition is, in the end, kind of creative destruction. And so in a lot of cases, we're seeing traditional cultures coming into conflict with a lot of cultures that are up in the north. Take, for example, the fight that's taking place between the United States and that of the Middle East right now. The second problem that's taking place is outsourcing and manufacturing. What we're seeing in order to have those jobs that we're talking about in the cheaper areas of the world is a lot of manufacturing jobs are leaving places like the United States and Europe, which is causing a lot of anger as companies are going out and seeking out cheap labor. And then last off, and this is kind of what we're seeing today, especially with the Trump administration and Brexit off in Britain, is the return to nationalism and the fight of nationalism in response to these traditional culture battles as well as the manufacturing jobs. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of globalization that's going to help you out with your project, and we'll answer more questions when you get to class. See you soon. Bye.